Human history is a hot mess of greed, plagues, and people inventing new ways to be awful, but it's also a timeline of brilliance, survival, and the occasional "holy crap, we actually pulled it off" moment. Back in the day is where we dig up both sides, the disasters and the genius, the villains and the visionaries, and all the weird in between. On today's episode, we look into the life of a poet, philosopher, professional avoider of small talk. He built himself a pond-side shack, then wrote a book convincing everyone that solitude was basically a moral upgrade. He believed humanity was chasing meaningless junk, so he ghosted everyone for 2 years, came back with a book he wrote called Walden, and looked very pleased with himself as a man who hadn't heard a single stupid opinion in 24 months.
He avoided rent, avoided taxes, and told the government to eat shit and die in the nicest 19th century social media post imaginable. Today, on Back in the Day, we look at the life of Henry David Thoreau. He was born July 12, 1817, in Concord, Massachusetts, home of pencils, revolution, and people who talk too much about both. Later in life, he worked as a teacher, surveyor, pencil maker, and occasional lecturer. Thoreau lasted only a few weeks at the Concord Public School before quitting over the policy of beating students. Apparently, the job description was educator and part-time enforcer, and he wasn't about to go full WWE on a bunch of fourth graders. Thoreau was a surveyor, which basically meant stomping around the wilderness with a compass, a notebook, and the hope you wouldn't get chased by someone's angry bull. In the 1840s, it was the closest thing to GPS. If GPS sometimes stopped to write poetry about a pine cone. Thoreau's family ran a small pencil-making business in Concord, and he jumped in to help, because nothing screams wild, rebellious writer like quality graphite. But here's the thing, the man was good at it. He nerded out over the process, tinkering with the mix of clay and graphite until he cranked out pencils that were considered some of the best in America. So yes, before he was the philosopher king of Walden Pond, Thoreau was basically the Steve Jobs of sharpened sticks. He gave public talks on nature, politics, and philosophy, often at local lyceums, public lecture halls that were basically the 1800s version of TED Talks, except instead of a headset mic, you had a room full of people who smelled faintly of horse. In 1845, Thoreau decided the world was too noisy, too busy, and too full of idiots, so naturally he bailed, built himself a tiny house before it was cool on Walden Pond in Massachusetts, on his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson's property. That was when he wrote the book Walden, his guide on how to live cheap and judge society, the ultimate "I'm better than you because I live near Duck's Flex." In his book Walden, Thoreau wrote, "I find it wholesome to be alone, the greater part of the time. To be in company, even with the best, is soon wearisome and dissipating. I love to be alone. I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. Or in other words, my favorite +1 is still just me, minus everyone." Later, in 1849, he dropped his critique called Civil Disobedience after spending one insightful night in jail for refusing to pay a poll tax that funded the Mexican-American War and supported slavery, which he opposed. These ideas that he expressed went on to inspire Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and countless other people who stood up to governments and said, "Yeah, no." In the book Civil Disobedience, Thoreau wrote, "A majority is permitted, and for a long period may continue, to rule, because they are physically the strongest, but it is not because they are most likely to be in the right." Or, in other words, the loudest crowd isn't always right. Sometimes they're just the ones
holding the stick.
Thoreau was quirky as hell. He would walk 20 miles just to clear his head. Hated dressing up for society bullshit, and if you annoyed him, he could verbally smoke you. He was a man who loved nature and solitude, but he wasn't always alone. Sure, he lived in the woods, but he still strolled into town for company, gossip, and the occasional pie. Walden wasn't so much off the grid as it was within comfortable walking distance of snacks. One of Thoreau's famous friends, Ralph Waldo Emerson, was his mentor, drinking buddy for deep thoughts, and occasional landlord. The Walden Pond cabin? Yeah, technically Emerson's property. Thoreau was basically the original guy crashing on his friend's couch to figure his life out. He once wrote, "I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life." Or in other words, he wanted the all-you-can-eat buffet of existence, not just the breadsticks.
Thoreau died on May 6, 1862, in his hometown of Concord, Massachusetts, at just 44 years old. The cause was tuberculosis, a disease he'd been battling, off and on, for decades. In true Thoreau fashion, when someone asked on his deathbed if he'd made peace with God, he said, "I did not know we had ever quarreled." The man went out swinging with wit. Thoreau wasn't a bestseller in his lifetime. Most people thought he was just that weird guy who wrote about ponds. But over time, Walden and Civil Disobedience became some of the most influential works in American literature and political thought. He started as the oddball in the woods and ended up the philosopher who taught the world how to live simply, fight injustice, and occasionally ghost society. Basically, he went from eccentric Concord hermit to patron saint of doing your own thing and telling authority to shove it.
So here's to you, Henry David Thoreau. You lived slow, thought hard, and reminded us that the loudest person in the room is usually full of shit. You told us to not waste time, live deliberately, and strip life down to its essentials. You were the original minimalist hipster, walking 20 miles a day, side-eyeing the government, and proving you don't need much to live a good life.
Henry David Thoreau